Welcome back to Boss Economics World, the only channel that calls out economic nonsense faster than a politician can say, "Trust me, I've got this under control." I'm your host, the Boss Economist, here to slice through the government's latest economic blunders with the precision of a sushi chef on a caffeine high. Today, we're diving into the US inflation mess of April 2025, a hot mess of tariffs, trade pacts, and consumer price chaos that screams one thing loud and clear: the government's mismanagement is driving us straight into the jaws of another recession. Buckle up, folks, because this is gonna be a wild ride. Let's start with the headline that's got Wall Street, Main Street, and probably your grandma's knitting circle in a tizzy. US inflation likely accelerated in April 2025, with the Consumer Price Index, CPI, jumping 0.3% from March, according to Bloomberg's Economist survey. And guess what's fanning the flames? Those shiny new tariffs on Chinese goods, courtesy of the government's economic playbook, which seems to be written in crayon by someone who flunked Econ 101. Oh, and don't forget the core CPI, that fancy metric that strips out food and energy, also rose at a similar pace, meaning this isn't just a fluke of volatile categories. Nope, this is systemic, folks, and it's got the fingerprints of government mismanagement all over it. Now, before we go any further, let's break this down for the regular folks out there, the ones who've been watching their grocery bills climb faster than a squirrel up a tree. Inflation means your dollar buys less, and when inflation accelerates, it's like watching your paycheck shrink in real time. And who do we have to thank for this? The geniuses in Washington, of course, who thought slapping higher tariffs on Chinese goods was a brilliant idea. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Let's talk tariffs, shall we? Back in April 2025, President Trump, yes, that Trump, still stirring the economic pot like a mad chef, announced a fresh round of punishing tariffs on Chinese imports. Toys, shoes, apparel, you name it, if it's got a "Made in China" label, it's getting hit. And what's the result? Prices are creeping up, and consumers are feeling the pinch. Bloomberg Economics, led by the sharp Anna Wong, noted that CPI categories heavy on Chinese imports are already seeing modest inflation. But here's the kicker: retailers are scared to pass on the full cost to consumers because demand could tank. So, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place: raise prices and lose customers, or eat the cost and watch profits vanish. Gee, thanks, government. Now, the apologists out there, the ones who think the government can do no wrong, are saying, oh, but the impact is limited. They point to exemptions for goods already en route to the US and the fact that businesses rushed to stockpile imports earlier in 2025 to dodge the tariffs. Julian Lafargue, chief market strategist at Barclays Private Bank, even had the audacity to say the CPI report is largely unaffected by the tariffs. Oh, really, Julian? Tell that to the mom who's paying 10% more for her kid's sneakers, or the dad who's shelling out extra for a new car because of front-loaded demand ahead of tariff-driven price hikes, as Bank of America economists Stephen Juneau and Gizio Park pointed out. Limited impact, my foot. And here's where it gets even juicier. Just when you thought the government couldn't make things worse, they pull a classic bait and switch. In May 2025, the US and China announced a 90-day trade pact to temporarily lower tariffs. Sounds great, right? Wrong. Bloomberg Economics warns this could lead to a catch-up period where retailers scramble to restock inventories, driving up demand and, you guessed it, fueling even more consumer price growth. So, the government's fix for their tariff mess might just pour gasoline on the inflation fire. Bravo, Washington, bravo. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty data, because here at Boss Economics World, we don't just rant, we back it up with cold, hard facts. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the CPI rose 0.3% in April 2025, reversing a decline from the previous month. Core CPI, which excludes food and energy, also rose 0.3%, signaling broad-based price pressures. And here's a fun fact: the shelter category, the thing that eats up the biggest chunk of your budget, is cooling off after a strong increase in March, but it's still a major driver of inflation. Meanwhile, goods inflation, excluding food and energy, ticked up 0.1% in April, per Bank of America's estimates, with bigger increases in the pipeline thanks to those lovely tariffs. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the services sector, which is a barometer for discretionary spending, aka, how much cash people have left after paying for the essentials. Citigroup economists Veronica Clark and Andrew Hollenhorst noted that travel-related categories like airfares and car rentals saw price drops in March and April 2025, signaling softening demand. Translation: people are tightening their belts because they're scared of what's coming next. And what's coming next, folks, is a government-induced economic storm. Oh, and let's not forget the egg situation. Yes, eggs, the poster child of food inflation in 2025. Economists at Morgan Stanley and Pantheon Macroeconomics pointed out a notable decline in egg prices in April, thanks to a drop in bird flu cases. Great, so at least your omelet is cheaper, right? Wrong. That's just a tiny bright spot in a sea of inflationary darkness, and it does nothing to offset the broader damage caused by the government's tariff tantrum. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't just about tariffs or eggs, it's about a cascading series of economic failures that all trace back to government mismanagement. Here's the chain reaction, step by step. 1. Tariffs jack up costs. Higher tariffs on Chinese goods increase the cost of imports, which retailers either pass on to consumers, hello, inflation, or absorb, goodbye, profits. This hits low and middle income families hardest, as they spend a larger share of their income on goods like apparel and toys. 2. Consumer confidence tanks. As prices rise, consumers get spooked. They cut back on discretionary spending, think travel, dining out, and big-ticket items like cars. Citigroup's data on falling airfares and car rental prices is a red flag that demand is softening, which is bad news for businesses and worse news for the economy. 3. Businesses suffer. Retailers and manufacturers, squeezed by higher costs and weaker demand, start laying off workers or freezing hiring. The U.S. unemployment rate, which was already creeping up to 4.2% in Q1 2025, per the latest Federal Reserve projections, could spike further if this trend continues. 4. Inflation persists. Fed gets nervous. With inflation accelerating, the Federal Reserve is caught in a bind. Do they raise interest rates to cool things down, risking a deeper slowdown? Or do they hold steady and let inflation spiral out of control? Pantheon Macroeconomics predicts the Fed might ease policy in the second half of 2025, but if tariffs keep driving up prices, that plan could go out the window. 5. Recession looms. Combine rising prices, falling demand, and a jittery Fed, and what do you get? A recipe for recession, folks. The National Bureau of Economic Research defines a recession as a significant decline in economic activity lasting more than a few months, and with GDP growth already slowing to 1.8% in Q1 2025, per the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, we're teetering on the edge. So, who's to blame for this economic train wreck? You guessed it, the government. Let's count the ways they've botched this. Tariff mania. The decision to slap higher tariffs on Chinese goods was a political stunt, not an economic strategy. It's a classic case of short-term posturing leading to long-term pain. Just look at the data. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office reported that U.S. imports from China fell 12% in 2024 due to earlier tariffs, but the cost of goods rose 3% on average, hitting consumers hard. And now, with the 2025 tariffs, we're seeing round 2 of this madness. Flip-flopping trade policy. The 90-day trade pact with China is a perfect example of the government's inconsistency. 1 minute, they're slapping on tariffs, the next, they're rolling them back. This uncertainty makes it impossible for businesses to plan, invest, or hire. The Institute for Supply Management's Manufacturing Index, which measures business confidence, dropped to 48.5 in April 2025, below 50 signals contraction, and guess what they cited as the top concern? Trade policy uncertainty. Shocker. Ignoring the Fed's warnings, the Federal Reserve has been sounding the alarm on inflation risks for months, but the government's response has been to double down on policies that make the problem worse. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell warned in his March 2025 testimony that trade disruptions could exacerbate inflationary pressures, but apparently, no one in Washington was listening. Here's the bottom line, folks, the government's mismanagement is pushing us toward a serious economic recession, and the warning signs are everywhere. Inflation is accelerating, consumer confidence is crumbling, and businesses are bracing for impact. The latest Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index fell to 95.2 in April 2025, down from 98.4 in March, the lowest level since mid-2023. Meanwhile, the University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index hit 92.1, signaling growing pessimism about the future. And let's not forget the yield curve, that trusty recession predictor, which inverted again in April 2025, with the 10-year Treasury yield falling below the 2-year yield by 10 basis points, per Bloomberg data. So, what's the solution? First, the government needs to stop treating the economy like a political piñata and start making consistent, data-driven decisions. Scrap the tariffs, stabilize trade policy, and let businesses and consumers breathe. Second, the Fed needs to tread carefully. Easing too soon could fuel inflation, but tightening too much could tip us into recession. And third, we, the people, need to hold our leaders accountable. Because if we don't, we'll all be paying the price, and I'm not just talking about higher egg prices. Well, folks, there you have it, another episode of Boss Economics World, where we shine a spotlight on the government's economic clown show. From tariffs to trade pacts to inflation run amok, it's clear that Washington's mismanagement is driving us straight into the ditch. But hey, at least your eggs are cheaper, right? Until next time, keep your wallets close and your skepticism closer. This is the Boss Economist, signing off.